Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the attempts at absolutism in England, right? So I know this is a little weird. We're at virtual again, right? And I know that this flip is probably going to be uploaded a little bit late just because my internet was out this morning, all right? Like, love how that happens, you know, on a day where it's just really crusty outside. But the big thing about it, though, is we're going to go ahead and record this, right? We're going to get it all uploaded, and we're going to get everything taken care of, right? Remember to double-check that at, posting, though, on Google Classroom. You're going to have this flip and a short one for homework as well, right? Where we're actually going to talk about this thing known as the Restoration Monarchy and the Glorious Revolution, right? But the big thing about it is we do have a lot to cover in this particular flip, and stay buckled in and tightened up for what's going on. I'm also going to go ahead and post your study guide as well, so you can start working on that, so you can keep everything kind of in order, because this is a really intense unit. Of course, we're also going to have all this weather issue, but it doesn't mean that you can't get it, right? And if you need any extra help, just come in and let me know, okay? But the big thing about it is we left off on our last flip talking about James the First and Sixth, right? We were talking about James the First and Sixth, the union of the crowns, right? And the rise of the Stuart monarchy. We were talking a lot, too, about how James showed tendencies of an absolutist, right? He literally thought that he was appointed by God. He thought that, the Puritans were the worst. And he also hates Parliament, right? He hates Parliament with a fury because he believes that he should never have to ask for permission to do anything, right? Thinks he should never have to ask for permission for tax money. He should never have to ask for permission to choose what religion he wants his country to be. He should never be worried about being blown up by Catholics and stuff like that. But as you can tell, he's got a lot of issues, right? He tried to outlaw tobacco that one time. He had all that controversy that we'll talk about in class. You can highlight the controversy thing if you want me to remember, to remind me to bring up all that stuff. The thing about it, though, is that James will do something really, really big that we need to focus on, right? And you should have wrote it down at the end of the last flip. Something that he did to Parliament was when he dissolved Parliament, right? So something that we need to understand about the process of dissolving before we can talk about his son, Charles I, we need to understand why that's such an egregious act, right? So when a king dissolves Parliament, he basically fires them, right? Now, he still can't do anything. He still can't raise taxes without their approval. He forces a brand new election and stuff like that. He forces a reopening of parliamentary procedure, and it's just a giant slap in the face of the English political system. But really quick, it's something that we need to understand. It is a power that the kings have, right? The kings and queens of England are allowed to dissolve Parliament when they so see fit, but it's usually supposed to be during a time of emergency, right? Of national emergency, of war, of need to actually kind of move the process up and stuff like that. But what we need to get at, though, is that James dissolved them because he was upset, right? He dissolved them because he was upset and they wouldn't let him do what he wanted to do, right? Well, the thing about it, though, is that this is going to anger the Parliament and cause a rift between the Stuart family and the Parliament itself. Now, incoming, though, we've got his son, okay? James is going to die in 1625, right? And what's going to end up going down is his son is going to rise up to power. Not his firstborn son, Henry, because Henry is dead. Henry died from tuberculosis or typhus or one of those other childhood diseases. And he actually is not going to be able to rise to power. Instead, it's going to be handed over to his weakling, skinny, annoying butt munch of a child, Charles I, right? Now, Charles I, okay, is going to rise as the next Stuart monarch. To give you a little bit of background about Charles, right? Charles is a very, very odd dude, right? Charles only grew to be about 5'4", right? He was very, very short. He was rail thin, super teeny tiny. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that he was very, very sickly as a child. And also because he thought it would actually make him look stronger and stuff like that, he would run several miles a day, keeping his frame very, very thin and very narrow, right? He also was born with a speech impediment, and he tried to fix it by putting rocks in his mouth one time, and he ended up shattering one of his teeth, right? Now the big thing about it, though, is that Charles, the thing we need to really kind of analyze more than anything else about him is he is perceived as weak, and he is constantly fighting against this, right? Now, when we're looking at his entire ascent, though, he does come down to England, and he ends up kind of actually, communing within his father's court, right? So James loved to party, right? Loved to party. Loved to be at Whitehall Palace and throw parties and do all this other stuff. And Charles found this embarrassing, right? He found this very, very embarrassing, and he thought that his father was misusing the mantle of king and thought that basically he should be going out there and trying to conquest and get more money and do all this other stuff, right? So, big thing about it, though, is there is something that he picked up from his dad, though. That idea of the divine right of kings, right? So, Charles I also believed in the divine right of kings, but not the James version. Charles thought that war was the best way to exert your power, right? But the thing about it is, though, is anytime you want to go to war, y'all, you need some cash, right? Now, keep in mind, in the back of your mind, there's this guy that's in the midst, right? There's this dude in the background that's very, very important. His name is the Duke of Buckingham, right? Also famously a character from Alexander Dumas' The Three Musketeers. He's a very real guy, though, right? The Duke of Buckingham was the personal assistant to James I, okay? James I, personal assistant, might have been more than that. We don't really know. But the big thing about it, though, is going into it, that's true. He might have been the very first openly bisexual king. I'm just saying he was. So anyway, we'll talk about that more in class, though, too. So the thing about it, though, getting into it is Duke of Buckingham, right, would always push James to go to war, would always push him to do all these different things and kind of like use him and puppet him from the background. And the Parliament absolutely hated his guts. Well, Charles, though, is going to be counseled by the Duke of Buckingham as well. After James dies, the Duke of Buckingham helps him out. And that's this whole controversy thing. That's George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, right there. So Charles I, though, really, really wanted to go to war because the Duke of Buckingham was encouraging him to invade Spain, right? But the thing that y'all need to keep in the back of your mind is, war is really expensive, and you need a lot of tax money to go do that. Parliament refused to pay taxes, though, so Charles dissolved them, right? So, now, this is going to help anger the Parliament very, very intensely. He then brings them back, and then he wants to go to war in France, and then he dissolves them again. He then brings them back, and he does all this other things. You have to understand, this is unheard of, because Charles is going to dissolve Parliament multiple different times, right? Multiple different times. And this is going to garner a very, very large hatred of the English people towards their king. The people of England did not like Charles I, right? And to be quite frank, he didn't like them very much either. But the big thing about it, though, is there's a lot of reasons why they didn't like Charles I. They didn't like his warmongering. They didn't like how involved the Duke of Buckingham was. They didn't like the fact that also he married a Catholic. Write that down. Charles married a Catholic on top of dissolving Parliament multiple different times, right? Now, I know y'all as young 15-year-old and 16-year-old Catholic girls don't see a problem with this, but he didn't get married a young 15-year-old Catholic girl who's from France as well, one of their biggest enemies, right? So the process, though, or in this entire process, they also didn't like each other very much at first. Her name was Henrietta, and they absolutely hated each other's guts, early on, because she thought he was a pansy, and he thought she was a brat. So, going into it, though, he's going to dissolve Parliament multiple times whenever he doesn't get his way. 9 times out of 10 is when he wants to go to war, right? Now, one really, really big one, though, comes after the Duke of Buckingham dies, right? So, that guy, the Duke of Buckingham that we were talking about that was pushing him to go to war all the time and stuff like that, that was also the advisor to his father. So the thing that's going to end up happening, though, is that after a failed invasion of France, okay, he's going to get stabbed to death, right? By one of his own troops. And so what's going to end up happening, though, is he demands that they actually hunt this man down. It doesn't really, really pan out. He gets mad at the Parliament yet again, and he dissolves them. But this time, for an unheard of amount of time. You need to highlight this 14 times, okay? It's a very, very big deal. This time, Charles dissolves them for 11 straight years, right? So for 11 years, England would be without a parliament, right? Now, this is unheard of in English history, and he referred to this time period as his 11 years of personal rule, right? Well, the people of England called it the 11 years of tyranny, right? They actually were like, oh, this is a terrible time for us to be around because our king is trying to force his ideas on us, collect taxes on his own and stuff like that. The people are going to grow to hate him during this time period, right? So the thing you need to understand, though, is during this 11 years of tyranny, he collected taxes by himself. He did this thing called ship money, which is really, really dumb, and he actually is kind of exerting his power over cities and making them give him a boat or the money for a boat, which is really ridiculous. The other big thing that is going to happen as well is he's going to charge coronation fines during this process. He's going to use a lot of the money to redo his palace with this huge banqueting hall inside of it. Oh, by the way, y'all know that lady that he got married to, the 15-year-old French Catholic that he got married to, that absolutely didn't like him? This is when they fell in love, right? So during the 11 years of tyranny, she was like, oh, you're such a man now, Charles. And they ended up having 2 kids, right? During this time period, named Charles and James. Really unfortunate series of names. Literally, pick a different name, right? So there was a James, now there's a Charles, then there's going to be another Charles and a James. Any other name would be awesome. So, going into it, though, you have to understand that the people are going to hate his guts during this time period. Now, what's going to end up going down, though, that's going to force England to bring back its parliament is this thing called a rebellion, right? A rebellion is going to break out, and he's going to need cash, right? And the rebellion is going to break out in Scotland, right? Now, it's this thing called the Bishop's War when you really, really look into it. and he's desperately going to need cash to put that rebellion down, right? Because you need money to go to war, and if you're going to go up into Scotland and actually try to put this rebellion down, you're going to need some cash, right? And so he calls Parliament back. Now, this time period is known as the Long Parliament because Parliament, when they come back, they actually stay in session for quite some time, right? Now, going into it, though, Parliament, though, then decided to check his authority. And then after this moment, they were like, we're going to actually go into this, and we're going to hurt him. We're going to hurt him good. We're going to make him sad, right? And so what they did is they actually put on trial and arrested his best friend, and they had him executed, right? Now, this one individual that I can never remember his name. I gotta go back and look it up. Now, literally this one guy that was like one of his best friends, Charles's best friends, would stand up. He was a member of Parliament. He would like stand up in Parliament all the time and be like, I think Charles is trying his best, right? And then literally the people would be like, boo, this is dumb. And so like they absolutely hated his guts. And so for being connected to Charles during the 11 years of tyranny, they decided to arrest him and have him executed, right? And then also, they forced Charles to sign his death warrant, right? And he like cryingly does it because he has to, because according to the Magna Carta, he has to follow these guidelines and rules because he's a limited monarch, right? So going into it, you also have to understand that once this happens, also, Henrietta, his wife, would have never allowed this to happen, but y'all, she was on vacation. When this whole thing with his best friend went down, she was actually visiting her family in France, right? And so when she comes back, she's irate. She is furious, right? She is upset. She's like, Charles, how dare you allow them to exert their power over you like that? That is disgusting. You are the king. You were appointed by God. You should march down there and have those members of Parliament arrested. And also because I heard the word on the street, because there was a rumor going around London, that the Parliament is actually the one who started the rebellion to force you to bring him back. So Charles, in a big harumph, gets really, really upset, marches his way down to Parliament, knocks on the door of the House of Commons and says, open the door in the name of the king, to arrest the top 5 reigning members of Parliament. But what ended up happening is they all said, no, and they laughed at him. They literally laughed. They were like, no, ha 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 ha. When he actually knocked on the door and said to open it, right? And so in a state of fury, he has the door broken down. But when he gets in there, the members of Parliament that he's there to arrest, the top 5 members, had escaped out of a back door, which is so anticlimactic when you really, really think about it. Like, literally, he goes down there to arrest these guys and potentially have them executed, and it's just 5 dudes in powdered wigs and black robes just sneaking out a back door going, tee, and just, like, running away. So the thing about it, though, is they escaped, and he is embarrassed by this moment, but what this is going to lead to, though, is he's going to run away and raise an army, because he feels like he's being defied by the Parliament that he's, dissolved multiple different times. So he runs away to raise an army. Well, the Parliament decides to answer this, and they raise an army of their own. But y'all, really quickly, if we have an army being raised by the king and an army being raised by the Parliament, sounds to me like we got this thing called a civil war on our hands, right? Because we're about to have fighting within a country, okay? And because of this, the English Civil War begins, right? Now, what is the ultimate cause to this? Because literally Charles couldn't stop dissolving Parliament, couldn't stop trying to exert his divine right. That 11 years of tyranny is a big cause to this as well. But the English Civil War breaks out, and it runs from 1642 to 1651, okay? Now, there are 2 sides to every Civil War, okay? Like, for example, when you look at the American Civil War, there was the North and the South, aka the Union and the Confederacy, aka their nicknames, known as the Yankees and the Rebels, right? So the thing about it is when you look at the growth of civil wars, typically there is an official name that you go by, and then there is a new name or a nickname that the other group will call you, right? So similar kind of thing right here, okay? Whereas the old model army, also known as the Charles supporters, okay, are going to be like the old aristocrats and stuff like that. And then you've got the new model army, which is going to be the parliamentarians and stuff like that. Those are their official names. But they actually made fun of each other by calling them each other different names. So, for example, these guys, the Parliament supporters, made fun of the Charles supporters by calling them Cavaliers, right? Because there's actually, like, it's a foreign word that actually refers to mounted Spanish soldiers known as caballeros. And they're basically saying you're a bunch of rich pansies, right? And then the Charles supporters, called the parliamentarians, Roundheads, because we don't really know why, but it could have been about their helmet, or possibly could have been about the fact that they literally had like buzz cut like boys that would actually like to avoid lice and stuff like that. So they literally might have just been bald. So like now going into it though, that right there is what a cavalier looks like. That right there is what a roundhead looks like. We need to understand though too really quickly, when you actually see a cavalier on the street, how do you spot one so you can tell the difference between a cavalier soldier and a parliamentarian soldier, right? Or a roundhead soldier. Well, Cavaliers, as you can see, because they're Charles supporters, are very wealthy, right? Because look at their three attributes that kind of indicate their wealth. One, they have very, very long hair, right? Because it took a lot of money to take care of your hair at the time. So, like, having hair that long was a really big deal. They also typically had mustaches, which was very, very popular at the time. And they would wear ostrich plume feathers in their hair. Now, interestingly enough, some of y'all actually interact with the word cavalier, like, regularly, because it's used as a mascot for many, many, many different universities and professional sports teams, right? For example, you got the Cleveland Cavaliers that LeBron James started with his career out with. You also have the University of Virginia Cavaliers that actually use this image from the English Civil War as their mascot. But then this right here is, of course, a roundhead soldier that you can see has a rounded helmet on, wears cheaper clothes, and also might be bald under that bad boy for all we know. But the English Civil War is going to break out, and we need to understand who's going to be leading the other side. Charles leads his parliamentarians along with his officers, and the roundhead leader is this man by the name of Oliver Cromwell, right? Oliver Cromwell is going to be a very important figure in European history, and he is going to span multiple different units because of his influence on British politics, right? Now, Oliver Cromwell, though, something we need to understand about him as well, is that he is a Puritan, right? So he's a very intense personality. Hey, Pierre, you leave your sister alone. So he's a very intense personality, and he plans on making a lot of changes in England if he wins, right? Well, the Roundheads are going to win. So fun fact, like, just to be quick and easy about it, the Roundheads under Oliver Cromwell end up winning this civil war, which is surprising because you would think that the richer, more well-armed outfit of the Cavaliers would win, but Charles I's forces lose, right? They actually lose to Oliver Cromwell's tenacious tactics, aggressive battles, and they lose at like a couple of big battles like the Battle of Naseby and the Battle of Edge Hill. And what ends up happening is Oliver Cromwell's parliamentarians are victorious, right? And so they reinstate the parliament, and now they've got to decide what to do with this pesky little king that wouldn't mind what he's supposed to do. And so Charles, though, after the parliamentarians win, go up to him and force him to sign several new documents implementing his power being aggressively limited and making him a full constitutional monarch again. And so what ends up happening, though, is Charles refuses to sign these documents, and the parliamentarians feel, though, that since you refuse to sign the documents, you shall be arrested like any other common man. So they arrested Charles I, y'all, tried him, and they executed him. He is the only leader up to this point that has ever been executed by his own people. I'm going to say that again. The only leader up to this point to ever be executed by his own people. Notice I keep emphasizing up to this point because in 1793 that's going to change. So the thing about it, though, is he is put on trial by his own people. They vote for his execution, and by the margin of one vote, they decide to have him executed. And this is the picture right here of the day that Charles was executed. He put his head down willfully on the block. They cut his head off, and literally, apparently, they picked it up and then showed it to the people of England, right? So the thing that you need to understand about that, too, apparently he wore two shirts when he went out there as well that day because it was kind of chilly and he didn't want to shiver in front of everybody, which I find kind of silly. So going into it, though, that is going to end up going down. Charles I is dead. England is now without a king. Now, some of y'all are like, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, but I thought Henrietta and Charles had two sons. Do they take over now? Well, interesting little fact, that's a great question. No, because they actually aren't in England at the time. They are actually running around in France trying to stay safe during this English Civil War, and rightfully so, though, Charles' son's supposed to take over, but that's not what goes down. Instead, England moves into what is known as the Commonwealth period, right, where Oliver Cromwell is in charge. Now, Oliver Cromwell is not a king. Don't mess this up. Don't get twisted, okay? Cromwell is the leader of the parliament, right? So technically, England is going to have 11 years without a king. And that 11-year time period is known as the Commonwealth period. 11 years in English history where they did not have a king is absolutely crazy to even think about. Because England has always had a king, but not anymore. They will now be a republic, a la ancient Rome republic, right? Now, what's going to end up going down, though, it's also going to be ran by Puritans, which is horrifying. All right, so like now, why do we have uh-oh right there? Because Puritans don't like fun. All right, so like now, Puritans hate these things, right? Like fun and stuff like that. So they're going to ban and outlaw a bunch of stuff, but we're going to start talking about that stuff in your Flip for Homework, where we actually review this whole thing and we go into this thing called the Restoration Monarchy. But I'll talk to y'all about that soon. Y'all have a good one.